The Isle of the Torturers by Clark Ashton Smith. Part 1. Between the sun's departure and return, the silver death had fallen upon Euros. Its advent, however, had been foretold in many prophecies, both immemorial and recent. Astrologers had said that this mysterious malady, heretofore unknown on earth, would descend from the great star, Achernar, which presided balefully over all the lands of the southern continent of Zothique. And having sealed the flesh of a myriad men with its bright, metallic pallor, the plague would still go onward in time and space, borne by the dim currents of ether to other worlds. Dire was the silver death, and none knew the secret of its contagion or the cure. Swift as the desert wind, it came into Euros from the devastated realm of Tsuun, overtaking the very messengers who ran by night to give warning of its nearness. Those who were smitten felt an icy, freezing cold, an instant rigour, as if the outermost gulf had breathed upon them. Their faces and bodies whitened strangely, gleaming with a wan lustre, and became stiff as long-dead corpses, all in an interim of minutes. In the streets of Silpon and Siloa, and in Farad, the capital of Euros, the plague passed like an eerie glittering light from countenance to countenance under the golden lamps, and the victims fell where they were stricken, and the deathly brightness remained upon them. The loud, tumultuous public carnivals were stifled by its passing, and the merrymakers were frozen in frolic attitudes. In proud mansions, the wine-flushed revellers grew pale amid their garish feasts, and reclined in their opulent chairs, still holding the half-emptied cups with rigid fingers. Merchants lay in their counting-houses on the heaped coins they had begun to reckon, and thieves, entering later, were unable to depart with their booty. Diggers died in the half-completed graves they had dug for others, but no one came to dispute their possession. There was no time to flee from the strange, inevitable scourge. Dreadfully and quickly, beneath the clear stars, it breathed upon Euros, and few were they who awakened from slumber at dawn. Fulbra, the young king of Euros, who had but newly succeeded to the throne, was virtually a ruler without a people. Fulbra had spent the night of the plague's advent on a high tower of his palace above Farad, an observatory tower equipped with astronomical appliances. A great heaviness had lain on his heart, and his thoughts were dulled with an opiate despair, but sleep was remote from his eyelids. He knew the many predictions that foretold the silver death, and moreover he had read its imminent coming in the stars, with the aid of the old astrologer and sorcerer, Vemdes. This latter knowledge he and Vemdes had not cared to promulgate, knowing full well that the doom of Euros was a thing decreed from all time by infinite destiny, and that no man could evade the doom unless it were written that he should die in another way than this. Now, Vemdes had cast the horoscope of Fulbra, and though he found therein certain ambiguities that his science could not resolve, it was nevertheless written plainly that the king would not die in Euros. Where he would die, and in what manner, were alike doubtful. But Vemdes, who had served Altath, the father of Fulbra, and was no less devoted to the new ruler, had wrought by means of his magical art an enchanted ring that would protect Fulbra from the silver death in all times and places. The ring was made of a strange, red metal, darker than ruddy gold or copper, and was set with a black and oblong gem not known to terrestrial lapidaries, that gave forth eternally a strong aromatic perfume. The sorcerer told Fulbra never to remove the ring from the middle finger on which he wore it, not even in lands afar from Euros and in days after the passing of the Silver Death, for if once the plague had breathed upon Fulbra, he would bear its subtle contagion always in his flesh, and the contagion would assume its wonted virulence with the ring's removal. But Vemdes did not tell the origin of the red metal and the dark gem, nor the price at which the protective magic had been purchased. With a sad heart, Fulbra had accepted the ring and had worn it, and so it was that the Silver Death blew over him in the night and harmed him not. But waiting anxiously on the high tower and watching the golden lights of Farad rather than the white, implacable stars, he felt a light, passing chillness that belonged not to the summer air. And even as it passed, the gay noises of the city ceased, and the moaning lutes faltered strangely and expired. A stillness crept on the carnival, and some of the lamps went out and were not relit. In the palace beneath him there was also silence, and he heard no more the laughter of his courtiers and chamberlains. And Vemdes came not, as was his custom, to join Fulbra on the tower at midnight. So Fulbra knew himself for a realmless king, and the grief that he still felt for the noble Altath was swollen by a great sorrow for his perished people. Hour by hour he sat motionless, too sorrowful for tears. The stars changed above him, and Achenar glared down perpetually like the bright, cruel eye of a mocking demon, and the heavy balsam of the black jewelled ring arose to his nostrils and seemed to stifle him. And, once the thought occurred to Fulbra, to cast the ring away and die as his people had died. But his despair was too heavy upon him, even for this. And so at length the dawn came slowly in heavens pale as the Silver Death, and found him still on the tower, In the dawn King Fulbra rose and descended the coiled stairs of porphyry into his palace, and midway on the stairs he saw the fallen corpse of the old sorcerer, Vemdes, who had died even as he climbed to join his master. The wrinkled face of Vemdes was like polished metal, and was whiter than his beard and hair, and his open eyes, which had been dark as sapphires, were frosted with the plague. Then, grieving greatly for the death of Vemdes, whom he had loved as a foster father, the king went slowly on. And in the suites and halls below he found the bodies of his courtiers and servants and guardsmen, and none remained alive excepting 3 slaves who warded the green, brazen portals of the lower vaults far beneath the palace. Now Fulbra bethought him of the counsel of Vemdes, who had urged him to flee from Euros and to seek shelter in the southern isle of Sintram, which paid tribute to the kings of Euros. And though he had no heart for this, nor for any course of action, Fulbra bade the 3 remaining slaves to gather food and such other supplies as were necessary for a voyage of some length, and to carry them aboard a royal barge of ebony that was moored at the palace porticos on the river Voum. Then, embarking with the slaves, he took the helm of the barge and directed the slaves to unfurl the broad amber sail, and past the stately city of Farad, whose streets were thronged with the silvery dead, they sailed on the widening jasper estuary of the Voum and into the amaranth-coloured gif of the Indaskian Sea. A favourable wind was behind them, blowing from the north over desolate Tassoon and Euros, even as the Silver Death had blown in the night, and idly beside them, on the Voum, there floated seaward many vessels whose crews and captains had all died of the plague. And Farad was still as a necropolis of old time, and nothing stirred on the estuary shores, excepting the plumy fan-shapen palms that swayed southward in the freshening wind. And soon the green strand of Euros receded, gathering to itself the blueness and the dreams of distance. Creaming with a whiny foam full of strange, murmurous voices and vague tales of exotic things, the halcyon sea was about the voyagers now beneath the high, lifting summer sun. But the sea's enchanted voices and its long, languorous, immeasurable cradling could not soothe the sorrow of Fulbra, and in his heart a despair abided, black as the gem that was set in the red ring of Vemdes. Howbeit he held the great helm of the ebon barge, and steered as straightly as he could by the sun towards Sintram. The amber sail was taut with the favouring wind, and the barge sped onward all that day, cleaving the amaranth waters with its dark prow that reared in the carven form of an ebony goddess. And when the night came with familiar austral stars, Fulbra was able to correct such errors as he had made in reckoning the course. For many days they flew southward, and the sun lowered a little in its circling behind them, and new stars climbed and clustered at evening about the black goddess of the prow. And Fulbra, who had once sailed to the Isle of Uccastrog in boyhood days with his father Altath, thought to see ere long the lifting of its shores of camphor and sandalwood from the winy deep. But in his heart there was no gladness, and often now he was blinded by wild tears, remembering that other voyage with Altath. Then, suddenly, and at high noon, there fell an airless cabin, and the waters became as purple glass about the barge. The sky changed to a dome of beaten copper, arching close and low, and as if by some evil wizardry, the dome darkened with untimely night, and a tempest rose like the gathered breath of mighty devils and shaped the sea into vast ridges and abysmal valleys. The mast of ebony snapped like a reed in the wind, and the sail was torn asunder, and the helpless vessel pitched headlong in the dark troughs and was hurled upward through veils of blinding foam to the giddy summits of the billows. Fulbra clung to the useless helm, and the slaves at his command took shelter in the forward cabin. For countless hours they were borne onward at the will of the mad hurricane, and Fulbra could see naught in the lowering gloom, except the pale crests of the beetling waves, and he could tell no longer the direction of their course. Then, in that lurid dusk, he beheld at intervals another vessel that rode the storm-driven sea not far from the barge. He thought that the vessel was a galley, such as might be used by merchants that voyaged among the southern isles, trading for incense and plumes and vermilion, but its oars were mostly broken and the toppled mast and sail hung forward on the prow. For a time the ships drove on together, till Fulbra saw, in a rifting of the gloom, the sharp and sombre crags of an unknown shore, with sharper towers that lifted palely above them. He could not turn the helm, and the barge and its companion vessel were carried toward the looming rocks, till Fulbra thought that they would crash thereon. But as if by some enchantment, even as it had risen, the sea fell abruptly in a windless calm, and quiet sunlight poured from a clearing sky, and the barge was left on a broad crescent of ochre-yellow sand between the crags and the lulling waters, with the galley beside it. Dazed and marvelling, Fulbra leaned on the helm, while his slaves crept timidly forth from the cabin, and men began to appear on the decks of the galley. And the king was about to hail these men, some of whom were dressed as humble sailors, and others in the fashion of rich merchants. But he heard a laughter of strange voices, high and shrill and, somehow, evil, that seemed to fall from above. And looking up, he saw that many people were descending a sort of stairway in the cliffs that enclosed the beach. The people drew near, thronging about the barge and the galley. They wore fantastic turbans of blood red, and were clad in closely fitting robes of vulturine black. Their faces and hands were yellow as saffron. Their small and slaty eyes were set obliquely beneath lashless lids, and their thin lips, which smiled eternally, were crooked as the blades of scimitars. They bore sinister and wicked-looking weapons in the form of saw-toothed swords and doubled-headed spears. Some of them bowed low before Fulbra and addressed him obsequiously, staring upon him all the while with an unblinking gaze that he could not fathom. Their speech was no less alien than their aspect. It was full of sharp and hissing sounds, and neither the king nor his slaves could comprehend it. But Fulbra bespoke the people courteously in the mild and mellow-flowing tongue of Euros, and inquired the name of this land whereon the barge had been cast by the tempest. Certain of the people seemed to understand him, for a light came in their slaty eyes at his question, and one of them answered brokenly in the language of Euros, saying that the land was the Isle of Uccastrog. Then, with something of covert evil in his smile, this person added that all shipwrecked mariners and seafarers would receive a goodly welcome from Ildrak, the king of the isle. At this, the heart of Fulbra sank within him, for he had heard numerous tales of Uccastrog in bygone years, and the tales were not such as would reassure a stranded traveller. Uccastrog, which lay far to the east of Sintram, was commonly known as the Isle of the Torturers, and men said that all who landed upon it unaware, or were cast thither by the seas, were imprisoned by the inhabitants, and were subjected later to unending, curious tortures, whose infliction formed the chief delight of these cruel beings. No man, it was rumoured, had ever escaped from Uccastrog, but many had lingered for years in its dungeons and hellish torture chambers, kept alive for the pleasure of King Ildrak and his followers. Also, it was believed that the torturers were great magicians who could raise mighty storms with their enchantments and could cause vessels to be carried far from the maritime routes and then fling them ashore upon Uccastrog. Seeing that the yellow people were all about the barge and that no escape was possible, Fulbra asked them to take him at once before King Ildrak. To Ildrak he would announce his name and royal rank, and it seemed to him in his simplicity that one king, even though cruel-hearted, would scarcely torture another or keep him captive. Also, it might be that the inhabitants of Uccastrog had been somewhat maligned by the tales of travellers. So Fulbra and his slaves were surrounded by certain of the throng and were led toward the palace of Ildrak, whose high, sharp towers crowned the crags beyond the beach, rising above those clustered abodes in which the island people dwelt. And while they were climbing the hewn steps in the cliff, Fulbra heard a loud outcry below and a clashing of steel against steel, and looking back, he saw that the crew of the stranded galley had drawn their swords and were fighting the islanders. But being outnumbered greatly, their resistance was borne down by the swarming torturers, and most of them were taken alive, and Fulbra's heart misgave him sorely at this sight. And more did he mistrust the yellow people. Soon he came into the presence of Ildrak, who sat on a lofty brazen chair in a vast hall of the palace. Ildrak was taller by half a head than any of his followers, and his features were like a mask of evil wrought from some pale gilded metal. And he was clad in vestments of a strange hue, like sea purple brightened with fresh flowing blood. About him were many guardsmen, armed with terrible scythe-like weapons, and the sullen, slant-eyed girls of the palace, in skirts of vermilion and breast cups of lazuli, went to and fro among huge basaltic columns. About the hall stood numerous ingenieries of wood and stone and metal such as Fulbra had never beheld, and having a formidable aspect with their heavy chains, their beds of iron teeth, and their cords and pulleys of fish skin. The young king of Euros went forward with a royal and fearless bearing, and addressed Ildrak, who sat motionless and eyed him with a level, unwinking gaze. And Fulbra told Ildrak his name and station, and the calamity that had caused him to flee from Euros, and he mentioned also his urgent desire to reach the Isle of Sintram. "It is a long voyage to Sintram," said Ildrak with a subtle smile. "Also, it is not our custom to permit guests to depart without having fully tasted the hospitality of the Isle of Uccastrog. Therefore, King Fulbra, I must beg you to curb your impatience. We have much to show you here, and many diversions to offer. My chamberlains will now conduct you to a room befitting your royal rank. But first I must ask you to leave with me the sword that you carry at your side, for swords are often sharp, and I do not wish my guests to suffer injury by their own hands." So Fulbra's sword was taken from him by one of the palace guardsmen, and a small ruby-hilted dagger that he carried was also removed. Then several of the guards, hemming him in with their scythed weapons, led him from the hall and by many corridors and downward flights of stairs into the soft rock beneath the palace. And he knew not whither his 3 slaves were taken, or what disposition was made of the captured crew of the galley. And soon he passed from the daylight into cavernous halls illumined by sulphur-coloured flames in copper cressets. And all around him, in hidden chambers, he heard the sound of dismal moans and loud, maniacal howlings that seemed to beat and die upon adamantine doors. In one of these halls, Fulbra and his guardsman met a young girl, fairer and less sullen of aspect than the others, and Fulbra thought that the girl smiled upon him compassionately as he went by, and it seemed that she murmured faintly in the language of Euros, "Take heart, King Fulbra, for there is one who would help you." And her words, apparently, were not heeded or understood by the guards, who knew only the harsh and hissing tongue of Uccastrog.